I'm delighted to introduce Professor Abou El Fadl and to welcome all of you to the second of a three-part lecture series entitled Shariah Watch, A View from the Inside on the Islamic law system, Sharia, and its role and impact in the West. This program is co-sponsored by the Critical Race Studies program here at UCLA School of Law, the von Grunebaum Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA, the Journal for Islamic and Near Eastern Law, and the UCLA Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program, and we're very grateful to all of our sponsors for their support for the program. In addition, because as many of you know who received the recent announcement for this event, as a result of events currently unfolding in Egypt, and because we are so lucky to have Professor Abou El Fadl here, who is a distinguished expert on Egypt and himself Egyptian American, he has agreed graciously to adjust the lecture that he had intended to give today to at least reflect in part his views on events unfolding in Egypt, and perhaps more importantly from the perspective of our audience members, to also indulge in a question and answer session which will include questions you may have about events unfolding in Egypt. So it just remains for me to introduce Professor Abou El Fadl, who should in fact need no introduction here at UCLA, certainly at the law school or at the university more broadly. But Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award in 2007 for his lifetime contribution to the field of human rights. He was also named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2007. He teaches Islamic jurisprudence, international human rights, and political asylum at the UCLA School of Law, and he's also the chair of the UCLA Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program. In light of the discussion today, I also want to mention that Professor Abou El Fadl spent 3 months last summer in Egypt as the privileged guest of the Sheikh of Al-Azhar University and the Grand Mufti of Egypt, in order to give a distinguished lecture series in Egypt on Islamic law. So he's an Islamic law authority not only for American audiences, but also, of course, for indigenous Muslim audiences of the Middle East and in Egypt. But in addition, his being honored in this way reflects his institutional connections to Egypt and the degree of his expertise, and how fortunate we all are to have him here with us today to address current events in addition to Islamic law. So please join me in thanking Professor Abou El Fadl for providing us with this lecture in advance and welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you. Of course, most of the current questions and inquiries that I've received as the date where this lecture came up are the historically monumental events that are taking place in Egypt and, of course, Tunisia. And but this three lecture series is intended as a way of making myself as a resource, or available as a resource. So I'm going to focus my comments on the Egyptian context, but in question and answer, you can bring anything up related to Sharia or to Egypt or to Sharia in the United States. In many ways, I do think that the events in Tunisia and in Egypt will have a considerable impact on the future dynamics of Sharia in the West, as well as perhaps the construction and reconstructions of Sharia in a variety of ways. Okay, well, first, the most basic question is what is happening in Egypt, and perhaps looking at this from a different angle, was what is taking place in Egypt predictable? Could it have been foreseeable? I remember in not this past summer, but the summer before, there was a book that came out called Inside Egypt, or Inside Mubarak's Egypt, if I recall correctly. And the author of that book argued that Egypt is ready to explode. And the book was banned by the Mubarak regime, but like a lot of things of this nature that take place in Egypt, it was smuggled and translated and made available anyway. And I think that the consensus of definitely most Egyptians, the vast majority of Egyptians, and Arabs as well, was yes, there might be an explosion in Egypt, but it will be an expression of frustration, degradation, anger, but it will not be anything beyond that. Now, importantly, the Mubarak regime, which exercised a far more subtle and layered method of authoritarianism than the Nasser regime, for instance. And in some ways, also a much more complex form of authoritarianism than Sadat's regime, quite purposely, in my view, and quite consciously engineered the perception or the feeling that an overthrow or an ultimate change in the Egyptian system of government is practically impossible. Now, there are a variety of ways that they did this, but it included a huge edifice of measures. The most blatant and simple and obvious level, anyone that would visit Egypt would observe the sheer number of military security officers, usually belonging to al-Markazi, wearing black suits, quite often parked at corner streets in armored trucks with some very high-powered weaponry, very deadly, lethal-looking, intimidating weaponry. It was well known that the Mubarak regime made sure that if there's, and this was actually a very conscientious principle, that if a demonstration comes out under any circumstances, a demonstration, whether it's anger over bread or anger over the failure to provide sanitary sources of water or some labor dispute, that two things. One is to make sure that the security forces available in the event exceed the number of demonstrators several-fold. And if you think about it, it's quite remarkable, because if there are 1,000 demonstrators, well, you make sure the security forces present about 5,000, so that the demonstrators feel swallowed by the security forces. Second is to rely on a rather old, historically old, but quite effective method of plain-clothes individual who act as who function to combust the act of protest from the inside. So these plainclothes, whether they're officers or informants or hoodlums or whatever they are, they were on the payroll of the government, and they would mingle into the demonstration, and at a certain point, a certain signal, The next thing you see is that these plainclothes individuals would come out with a knife or a blade and literally start stabbing or slashing everyone around them, everyone in their vicinity. That produces quite a panic because you see blood, you see screaming, but you're not. It takes you a while to understand who's causing or doing what. And what also then the Mubarak government started implementing, especially in the 90s, was also to make sure that if there are female demonstrators, that the plainclothes police would attack the women demonstrators and rip some or all of their clothing off as a way of insulting and humiliating them. And now, this is just in terms of tactics, but at the same time, the Mubarak regime made it quite well known that it had a very complex system of prisons in Egypt, some that had mythical reputations of gore and just sheer terror, like Signal Arab, or translated as Scorpion. Signal Arab, few people who had entered it were ever allowed to leave. That helped create a mythology about a prison like that. And there were numerous other prisons that are built out in the desert and carefully monitored so that those who are brought into these prisons are not the category of people who would ever emerge out. And I'm talking about political dissidents here. That, of course, created some very fantastical stories about what happens to people in these prisons, since you really would not encounter someone who's been there and has come out. And the matrix of prisons were quite remarkable at any time in Egypt by reports of Human Rights Watch, where I've done most of my work, but also Amnesty International and other organizations. The detainees could, an average year, range from 80,000 to 100,000. And these are the ones that we can say are documented in some form. It was widely propagated by the government that while per Camp David peace treaty, that the military forces had to be kept at, I think, 250,000 or 350,000, I don't remember. I think it's 250,000. The security forces divided into 8 different institutions of security forces, many of them having overlapping jurisdictions, and they totaled a number of about 1 million soldiers. Now, since the vast majority of aid from the U.S. to the Egyptian government is conditioned, which is quite common in our foreign aid law, that the aid money be spent on American products, primarily American military hardware. A huge chunk of that aid, the biggest part of that aid, would go to equipping this massive security apparatus, and while you could see army trucks or army vehicles, sometimes old, scratched, scrappy, broken down, security forces always looked sparkling with it. I mean, their uniforms are perfect, their cars are always